So we're back with part two. On part one, we were talking about the Constitutional Convention. So we mentioned the first problem, which was the power and structure of government, and the compromise that resolved that, which was the Great Compromise of the Connecticut Plan. So the second problem that the delegates at the convention were faced with were what were the powers of the national government. So they looked at what were the powers under the Articles of Confederation. Were they strong enough? Were they not? Should Congress be able to regulate or make rules about commerce or business, trade? Should Congress be able to pass direct taxes on the states and the citizens, which they were not allowed under the Articles of Confederation? How specific should the powers be? Should they outline it very, very detailed about what Congress and the national government can do versus not? And then what powers will the states have? So these are all the kind of the questions that they were considering when they were talking about the powers of the national government. And the system that they ultimately came up with at the convention was a system that they called federalism, which there were specific national powers written in the Constitution with specific state powers in the Constitution, and then there were powers that were shared between the national and the state government, or things that they could both do. Okay, so specific national powers are things that you would want a national Congress to conduct for all the states. So things like a treaty with a foreign country that would affect all the states. The power to conduct war, the defense of all the states. The power to print money and regulate trade between states and countries. So we want to have a uniform currency, for the reasons that we saw under the Articles of Confederation. And also you want to have a national Congress make the trade rules so that states aren't putting unfair restrictions on other states within your own country. And those things just make sense. They're things that you would want a national Congress or national government to conduct for all of the states because it could do a better job of it than individual states themselves. The Constitution also reserves specific state powers for the states. So things like education, punishments for crime, that was originally a state power, marriage laws, and morality issues, things about like alcohol laws and the age for drinking and those sorts of things, when restaurants can be open and closed, those sort of things. So you have specific national powers, which we call enumerated powers. Write that down, enumerated. And then specific state powers, which we call reserved powers. Write that down, reserved. So we have enumerated and reserved powers. Then powers that they both can conduct are called concurrent. Concurrent, meaning they can occur at the same time. So concurrent. An example of that, and the best example of that, would be taxing. Both the national government and the state government were given the power to collect taxes from the citizens and direct taxes from the citizens. Okay? So we have this federalism, this division of powers into national powers and to state powers. And it also creates a system where you are a citizen of two entities. You're a citizen of the United States, and you're also a citizen of the state you live in, because there are two governments that are making laws that affect your life. Okay? And we'll get more into federalism tomorrow in class because it's a big topic, and you need to understand how it operates. Okay? So on the powers of government, there was one issue in particular that some of the states disagreed with, and it was a North-South disagreement on regulating and taxing trade. Now, the South generally opposed taxing imported goods. The question is why? The South relied on imported goods more than in the northern states. There's a little less manufacturing in the South than there was in the Northeast. And the South generally, actually, one of the things that they imported most was cheap cotton clothes from Great Britain to give to their slaves. The South also feared a government taxing exports because they exported stuff, right? This is where the southern states made their money. They exported cotton around the world, exported tobacco and indigo and all those things. So they didn't want their goods to be to have to pay a tax to ship their goods out. They also didn't want to have to pay a tax to import things from around the world either. Okay, so there needed to be a compromise on this because the northern states generally wanted to give Congress the power to tax imports and exports. So they reached a compromise. And in this compromise, we call it the Commerce Compromise because it deals with taxing commerce. The states agreed that Congress could tax imported goods but not exported goods. They also allowed Congress to impose an excise tax or production tax on certain things. One of the first things they would put this tax on would be the production of alcohol. So to make alcohol, you had to pay, let's say, $1 per bottle of alcohol that you created. Okay, and that's it's just a production tax. So through the Commerce Compromise, we get a tax on imports but not exports to appease the southern states. And we also give Congress the power to lay an excise tax or production tax. Also gave Congress the power to regulate trade between states and countries. And this is really important because it now makes the national government a really powerful government. We talk about, regulating or making rules about business. You've now made the national government very powerful in the eyes of the states, in the eyes of the convention. Okay? All right. The final issue dealt with slavery. Now, banning slavery in all of the states was not going to happen. Okay? Congress had banned slavery in the Northwest Territory under the Land Ordinance of 1787, but it was not going to ban slavery for the southern states. So southern states said, listen, if you talk about ending slavery and banning it in the whole country, we're walking out of this convention because it had serious economic consequences for the southern states. So it was kind of agreed upon in the beginning that, all right, we're going to leave whether or not slaves are legal up to each individual state, with the exception of the Northwest Territory because Congress had already banned it there. So Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, etc. So some of the questions that were brought up about slavery, though, were, should slaves count as part of a state's population? Because population determined representation. So would the 3 million slaves living in the South count towards the population of those states? That would give them a lot more votes in Congress. Should the slave trade continue? Most of the world had banned it, including Great Britain. Would the United States continue to allow the slave trade to exist? And then, as we said, the last one, should slavery be banned? We know that was a non-starter. That wasn't going to happen. So on the issue of representation in Congress, the delegates agreed that not all of the slaves' population would count because they were not people, they were property. So, the northern states were like, look, you don't even treat them as people. They don't vote. They don't have any rights at all. And the southern states said, yeah, we still have to feed them and take care of them and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, the compromise was that 3/5 of a state's slave population would count towards its representation in Congress. This gave states like South Carolina and Georgia more representatives and more of a voice in the national government. But they also agreed that the slave trade would end in 1808. Now that's the international slave trade, not the internal slave trade, meaning that you could still import slaves from outside the country, from Africa or the Caribbean until 1808. After that, you could just trade slaves within the United States. Okay? This is probably the most significant compromise because it protects slavery in America. It puts in the Constitution that 3/5 of other persons count as representation in Congress, meaning you can own slaves now. Some key figures in the Constitutional Convention, just some people that we should be aware of. George Washington, he was the president of the convention. He didn't talk much, but he got that figure as the president of the convention because of his role in the Revolutionary War. And then that role as president of the Congress would catapult him into president of the United States. Edmund Randolph, I mentioned him earlier. He was a leading Virginia statesman, very influential, author of the Virginia Plan with Madison. However, Randolph did not sign the Constitution because he had some objections regarding citizens' rights and the power of the national government. He didn't think that the Constitution did a good enough job listing what citizen rights were. So he wouldn't sign it. Madison thought this was a big problem. He really wanted Randolph to sign it. William Patterson was the author of the New Jersey Plan. He was obviously from New Jersey. He had the interests of small states in his mind. Governor Morris, he was from Pennsylvania. He was an advocate of a very strong central government. He wanted a president with a life term and appointed senators. Of course, that didn't happen. And he was also part of the Committee of Style, which means he's largely responsible for wording the Constitution. So the kind of wordage and the way that it's written, Governor Morris played a big role in him, and he's a key Pennsylvanian. And then finally, we have Benjamin Franklin, who is Pennsylvanian. He helped break the deadlock on the voting of the Great Compromise. He gave a very impassioned speech and said, listen, yes, the Constitution has some problems in it. Yes, we don't like it. But if this is the worst government on the face of the earth, it's still the best. So he said, listen, it's got some flaws. Let's put them aside. We can't create anything better. It's going to be good. Alexander Hamilton was the great state builder. He supported a system of a very strong national government. We're going to learn a lot about him, but he's really in favor of a very strong national government and its powers. Okay, and he's, again, the great state builder, really a fan of the great British Constitution. Okay, so I want to ask this question: why is a document of compromises? What are the three sources of conflict? And explain how those conflicts were resolved. To do that, I want you to go to this Poll Everywhere site. So you can go to respond@pollev.com/NicholasTier214, or you can text NicholasTier214 to 37607. I suggest if you're watching this on the computer that you go to this one right here, and you can text your three sources of conflict during the Constitutional Convention, or type it out based on what the computer shows you. All right? And we'll talk about those in class tomorrow. So sources of conflict, again, pollev.com/NicholasTier214. Send that to me so we can talk about it in class. All right? And we'll see you tomorrow.